A group of Boy Scouts were hiking hundreds of yards from the nearest roadway, moving through the isolation of the woods, when they saw something on the forest floor. It was a plastic garbage bag covered in leaves. The scouts would approach and pull the plastic back, and inside they would find a human skull. The response from the St. Croix County Sheriff's Office was fast, but the scene didn't have much for the investigators. There was no evidence to collect. The bag had simply been discarded, tossed into the woods like garbage. This was not a skull that had been separated by an animal or the natural decay of tissue over time. The medical professionals examined the bone and noticed that it had been cleanly severed from the body at the base of the neck. The marks on the bone suggested that the tool used was a standard handsaw. The authorities were staring at a decapitation. The assumption was that the ravine had been chosen by a killer desperate to delay the identification of a murder victim. Without a face, without dental records, without fingerprints, a body is just an object. Removing the head is a way to buy time. But the investigators standing in that cold fall day in Wisconsin had no idea about the type of monster that they were hunting. When a person dies, their family is put into this blinding fog of grief. And in that vulnerable state, they sign a piece of paper and a stranger drives away with the physical remains of their mother or their father or their child. And those people don't get to watch what happens to the body. They trust the funeral directors to treat the body of their loved ones with love and to prepare it for viewing, and then to transfer it to the fire for cremation. In St. Croix Valley, the biggest funeral home was Simonet Funeral Home. They were located in Stillwater and Oak Park Heights, Minnesota. Simonet is a local institution. It has a history that dates back to the height of the Civil War in 1864, making it one of the oldest businesses in the region. But in the summer of 2001, a licensed funeral director named Benjamin Carl Hansen was employed at Simonet. He was 32 years old at the time. To the public, he was just another professional in a dark suit, offering condolences and guiding families through the worst days of their lives. Behind closed doors, Hansen was losing his mind. Investigators would learn that in the summer of 2001 was a period of psychological unraveling for Hansen. According to former coworkers interviewed by law enforcement decades later, Hansen was completely unhinged. Another coworker talked about how Hansen routinely used his position to take resources from the funeral home. He used his company credit card to buy school supplies, purchase replacement parts for his lawnmower, and finance HVAC repairs at his house. The funeral home would catch wind of his theft and fire him. Hansen allegedly targeted the new employee hired to replace him. He drove his car directly at the replacement worker, swerving before hitting him, which would cause the new employee to file a harassment restraining order. This was Benjamin Hansen. He was a man spiraling, and shortly before he was fired, Hansen was left alone in a preparation room with the body of a 92-year-old woman. Alice Katharina Peterson lived a nearly century-spanning life. She was born Alice Katharina Fillin in 1909, and she was the daughter of Swedish immigrants. She married, took the last name Peterson, and lived as a longtime resident in South Dakota before relocating to Stillwater, Minnesota for her final years. By the summer of 2001, Alice was 92 years old. In July of that year, she died. She had a medical emergency and was transferred to the hospital where she officially passed away. There was no mystery involving her death. She wasn't murdered. It wasn't an accident. It was just the end. And the Peterson family entrust her final arrangements to the Simonet Funeral Home. The file would be handed to Benjamin Hansen. Now, according to the official paperwork, everything went as exactly as it should go. All of the forms and authorizations and transport logs with Peterson's file had Hansen's signature. According to the paperwork, Alice Peterson's body was transported to Forest Lawn Cemetery in Maplewood, Minnesota, where she was cremated. The ashes were collected, placed into an urn, and handed back to the Peterson family. The loop was closed. The family mourned, they took the urn home, and they began the slow process of moving on. For 20 years, the Peterson family believed that their matriarch was resting peacefully in that urn. It was a lie. And 15 months later, a group of Boy Scouts would pull the first thread that would eventually unravel the entire situation. When the St. Croix County Sheriff's Office took the skull found in the Somerset ravine in October 2002, they gave the bones to the scientists. In the early 2000s, there were limits to forensic anthropology. When there's no flesh, there's no hair, and all the identifying markers degrade, investigators are left to look at the bones. They had to do bone reading. So the St. Croix County Jane Doe was sent to a forensic anthropologist. The profile that anthropologist came up with was a very bad misread that doomed the investigation. The initial assessment estimated the skull belonged to a female ages 35 to 60. The anthropologist believed that the victim was of Asian descent and that the victim was missing all of her teeth at the time of her death. With this profile, detectives from the St. Croix County Sheriff's Office went through regional and national databases looking for missing Asian or Native American women in their late 30s to late 50s who had vanished in the Midwest in the fall of 2001, and the search found nothing. Every bit of that biological profile was wrong. The investigators were looking for a middle-aged Asian woman who had been reported missing by her family. In reality, the skull belonged to a 92-year-old Caucasian woman of Swedish descent, whose family believed she was sitting safely in an urn on their mantle. With no matching missing persons reports, the skull was placed in the cold case archives. It was registered in the National Missing and Unidentified Persons Systems under case number UP909106 and left to wait. The years turned to decades. The Boy Scouts who found the bag grew up and moved on with their lives. The case stagnated, and the skull sat in an evidence locker. It would take a technological revolution to finally solve this problem. Cold case investigations had been transformed by the advent of investigative genetic genealogy. 23andMe. The St. Croix County Sheriff's Office pulled the skull from the evidence locker and gave it to the DNA Doe Project. The DDP is a nonprofit organization specializing in identifying unknown remains through highly advanced genetic mapping and genealogical tree building. The forensic science was impressive. Extracting DNA from a 20-year-old skull that had been exposed to the Wisconsin elements is a challenge. Bone does not give good DNA samples, but the bone would be transferred to Astrea Forensics in St. Cruz, California. Astrea is a laboratory designed to extract DNA from rootless hair and heavily compromised skeletal remains. And using their special extraction methods, Astrea successfully pulled a biological sample from the skull. That sample was sent to Hudson Alpha Discovery for whole genome sequencing, and the data would be passed to a man named Kevin Lord, who translated the biological data into a digital genetic profile that could be uploaded to a database like GED Match Pro and Family Tree DNA. And when the profile hit the servers, the initial 2002 forensic anthropological report, was exposed for being as bad as it was. The DNA didn't code for Asian or Native American markers. The woman in the ravine was Caucasian with deep, highly concentrated roots in Sweden. This breakthrough presented a new puzzle for the DNA Doe Project. The algorithm would flag a distant cousin, a woman living thousands of miles away in Stockholm, Sweden, who was the only genetic match to the unidentified skull. So the investigation would move to Stockholm. Genealogists began building out the Swedish woman's family tree, hunting for branches that extended to the United States. This is a slow and difficult process, but a breakthrough would materialize when researchers found a specific great-great-grand-uncle of the Stockholm match. The man had immigrated to the United States in the 1890s, changing his last name upon arrival to assimilate to American culture. In 1902, he married a fellow Swedish immigrant, and the couple had 7 children. The genealogist tracked the descendants of these 7 children as they spread across the American Midwest. The descendants had lived in Stillwater, Minnesota, just a few miles away from the Somerset, Wisconsin ravine where the Boy Scouts had found the skull. The genealogists isolated one of the 7 children, a woman named Alice Katharina Philin, born in 1909. She would be married, taking on the last name Peterson. But when they ran that name through the database, Alice Peterson was not a missing person, and she had died of natural causes following a medical emergency. She had a state-issued death certificate, and according to the official paperwork, Alice Peterson's body had been sent to Forest Lawn Cemetery where she was supposedly cremated. So to confirm the impossible, the St. Croix County Sheriff's Office tracked down one of Alice's living nieces in the Stillwater area and requested a DNA swab. Weeks later, the results returned from the lab. The niece shared approximately 25% of her DNA with the skull in the evidence locker, confirming a direct aunt-niece relationship. The identity was confirmed. The skull belonged to Alice Peterson. The fact that Alice's skull ended up where it did was a shock. The question for law enforcement became if Alice Peterson's skull was rotting in a garbage bag in a Wisconsin ravine in 2002, her body could not have been intact when it entered the cremation chamber in 2001. The investigation was no longer a cold case about an unidentified murder victim. It was an active manhunt for a necromutilator. They would pull the funeral files for Alice Peterson, and the paper trail led straight past the hospital, past the cemetery, and directly to Somerset Funeral Home in Stillwater. And sitting in the file, signed in ink on the transport logs and the authorization forms, was the name Benjamin Carl Hansen. So the police began tracking Hansen down. By 2025, Hansen was 57 years old, living in Bayport, Minnesota. When detectives confronted him with the overwhelming weight of evidence, the lie collapsed. Decades after the act, Hansen sat in an interrogation room and confessed. He admitted to law enforcement that in the summer of 2001, stood over the body of 92-year-old Alice Peterson in the preparation room and retrieved a handsaw. Hansen would say that he was suffering from severe mental illness at the time and was plagued by dark and intrusive thoughts while working alone among the dead. And driven by those thoughts, he sawed through the vertebrae at the base of Peterson's neck until her head was completely detached from her torso. The body was transported to the crematorium, but the whereabouts of the head remained with Hansen. According to his confession, Hansen attempted to hide the evidence by burying the severed head in a cemetery in Stillwater. He probably hoped that the head would decompose among the legally buried dead, masking his crime in a place where human bones were expected to be found. But something, maybe paranoia, maybe the actual logistics of digging a shallow grave, forced him to reconsider this plan. He would retrieve the severed head of Alice Peterson, placed it in a garbage bag, and placed the bag in his vehicle, and drove east. He crossed the bridge over the St. Croix River, leaving Minnesota behind, navigating rural Wisconsin. Finding a ravine near the Fred C. Anderson Boy Scout camp, Hansen stopped his car. He walked to the edge of the woods and threw the bag over the precipice, hoping that the wilderness would swallow his crime forever. He returned to his life. Allison Peterson's headless body was processed. The Peterson family was handed an urn containing ashes, unaware that they were incomplete, and Hansen was fired for stealing lawnmower parts and HVAC services, and he faded into the background of the Bayport community. He assumed he had gotten away with it. He thought that the woods would keep his secret. He didn't count on the Boy Scouts. For 23 years, Hansen lived in Bayport, just minutes away from the scene of the crime. The breakthrough by the DNA Doe Project tightened the net around him until there was no room left for him to wiggle out. In December 2025, the St. Croix County Sheriff's Office officially filed criminal charges. Benjamin Carl Hansen was arrested and charged with hiding a corpse, which is a Class D felony in Wisconsin, and theft of movable property for misappropriation of the funeral home funds. The arrest sent shockwaves through the St. Croix Valley. The horror of the crime was unbelievable. People who had used Simonet funeral home services were suddenly forced to wonder whether they had actually received their own loved ones' remains and whether they'd received the complete remains. The current ownership of Simonet Funeral Home did not own the business during Hansen's employment in 2001, were forced to issue a public statement through their attorney. They expressed deep condolences to the Peterson family and tried to distance the company from the sins of this rogue employee operating decades prior. In March of 2026, Hansen entered a guilty plea to the charge of hiding a corpse. In exchange for the guilty plea, the felony theft charges regarding the credit card misuse were dismissed. On Tuesday, June 2nd, 2026, Hansen stood before the Honorable Judge Scott Nordstrand in St. Croix County Circuit Court for his final sentencing. In a statement read to the court, Hansen expressed that he was mortified by his actions, reiterating that he was battling severe mental illness and dark intrusive thoughts during his time at the funeral home. He was sentenced to 90 days in jail for the decapitation of a 92-year-old woman. And to many, 90 days in jail felt insufficient to punish him for his crime. But the gavel fell, and Benjamin Harrison was taken to jail to serve his 90 days, and left behind questions that nobody could answer. There's the unresolvable grief of the Peterson family, who was forced to change the memory of their loved one through the lens of a horror movie. They will never get the answers that they're looking for. The most disturbing part of the entire story is when Alice Peterson died in July 2001, her family navigated their grief and paid for a service from a funeral home that they trusted. They received an urn from the funeral home, believing that it contained their beloved family member. And for over 20 years, that urn sat in their possession. But if Benjamin Hansen took Alice Peterson's severed head across the river to Wisconsin, then the ashes that they received were incomplete. And if a mortician was brazenly unhinged enough to decapitate a body, falsify the remains, and try to cover his tracks with a handsaw and a garbage bag, well, no one can ever know whose bones were actually burned in the crematorium that day. Nobody can actually know whose ashes that the family received. Please subscribe to this channel, The Spooky Lawyer. Please like and share this video. If you would like to support the channel, you could become a member of the channel. I appreciate you considering that. You can also support the channel by liking, sharing, hitting the hype button, and leaving a comment on the video. And I do appreciate you watching my videos. And please, stay spooky.